Our next speaker today is none other than journalist, academic, author, and media freedom activist Peter Greste. Working as a foreign correspondent, Peter has witnessed firsthand a variety of truly raw atmospheres, such as the Yugoslavian Civil War, Afghanistan, and environments across Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. Having spent over 30 years reporting for papers such as the BBC, Al Jazeera, and Reuters, I think it's more than safe to say that today we have someone who knows what they're talking about. But if that wasn't enough, then I think that Peter's own personal achievements speak for themselves. Mr. Greste is one of the founding members of the advocacy group Alliance for Journalist Freedom. He also joined the University of Queensland in 2018 and is the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation's Chair for Journalism and Communication. But just a bit on journalism before I introduce up our esteemed guest and why journalism is so crucial in our modern world. To summarise it, journalism is the publication of information to present the public with an overview of specific events and ideologies. Thus, it's clear that the very nature of reporting is rooted in the values of candour and impartiality. But more than that, journalism is an absolutely essential part of an open and liberal democracy. But why? Because journalists wield the power behind the truth to hold real organisations and government bodies accountable. That's why you see politicians like Donald Trump throwing temper tantrums because of the fake news and corrupt media that don't portray them as the golden protagonists that they pretend to be. And yet an increasing number of journalists are being persecuted for shedding light on these truths. An example of this is Peter Greste's own affair of having spent 400 days in an Egyptian prison. It sounds almost inconceivable, right? Well, the man we're about to hear from has not only been there and done that, but he's lived to tell the tale. The reality is that when you're unjustly imprisoned in a foreign nation without the help of legal aid and surrounded by people who are speaking in foreign languages to you, you've simply just got to wonder whether or not you'll ever see life behind the bars again. You wonder whether you'll ever see home again. And on that note, I'm extremely excited to welcome up Peter Greste to share with us his own story.
Thank you very much for that incredible introduction. That's probably one of the most comprehensive introductions I think I've ever had. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a fantastic honour to be invited to speak at the DIRRUM Festival. I was at the DIRRUM Festival down in Canberra and got the first-hand look at how you guys run these things and what an amazing opportunity it is to explore some really big, wonderful ideas. And I love the theme for this particular program, Inspirupting, which is, of course, that fantastic mashup of disruptive inspiration. When I heard that, of course, I realised that inviting a convicted terrorist is a perfect fit, although I'm not quite sure that's what the organisers had in mind when they asked me to come here and speak to you guys today. Before I get into this, let me set a few things straight. I'm not a life coach. I'm not some kind of spiritual guru. I'm not a psychologist or a specialist in anything other than my own experience. What I am is an ordinary guy who went through an extraordinary experience and learned a few things out of it along the way. And those are some of the things that I'd like to share with you today. So let me start with a bit of the background. As we just heard, I was working for Al Jazeera when I went to Egypt in December of 2013. I was there to cover the Christmas New Year period in Egypt as we saw an unfolding political crisis. For those of you who were paying attention to the news at the time, we saw the Muslim Brotherhood, who'd won the first democratic elections in the country's history after the fall of Hosni Mubarak in the popular uprising. But that government lasted only a year before they were toppled again by another popular uprising. And we saw the military step in to take power and take control over the country. So there was still an ongoing political struggle between the supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and the supporters of the interim military-backed government. My job, as someone who didn't really understand the country, was simply to play with what we call a very straight bat. I was doing journalism 101. The interim administration would introduce some changes to the constitution. We'd pick up the phone and call the opposition to get a response, and you'd find an analyst to make sense of it all. It was vanilla journalism, the most basic kind of journalism that there is. Now, of course, at the time, the opposition was the party that was last in power, the classic model of democracy, and that was the Muslim Brotherhood. They were still the most significant and important political force in the country, and I was simply doing my job as a journalist. But the government had started accusing the Brotherhood of being involved in acts of terrorism. Now, I didn't think too much of it. We took the government at their word when they said that they are supporters of a free press. It was written into their new constitution. The night of December 28th of 2013, I was getting ready to go out for dinner with an old friend of mine, another BBC correspondent who was also in town for that period. And I was dancing around the room as you do, listening to Triple J streaming through my laptop, when there was a knock on the door. Now, I didn't think too much of it. Usually when anybody wanted me, they used the telephones. It was a little bit unusual. I remember tucking my shirt in as I went to crack open the door again. There was a much more forceful knock. And as I cracked it open, I remember it was pushed in as if there was a powerful spring behind it. And I was pushed to the back of the room as the room was filled with about 8 or 10 guys. I still don't remember exactly how many there were. And they drove me to the back of the room and they started ransacking the place. They were in plain clothes. I didn't know who they were, but they moved with the real professionalism and a seriousness that said, these guys aren't fooling around. They're not just a gang of random thieves, that they know what they're up to. I was under arrest. Now, I didn't know what for at that point. I was taken down and thrown into a police cell. And that cell, it's a bit difficult to show you, I think, on the cameras, but roughly the size of this little stage up here. It was about 2 meters by 2 meters. So, yeah, as I said, about the size of this stage. And in one corner, there was a leaky tap. In another corner, there was a rather stinky squat toilet. And then there was a door, a steel door, and that was it. And inside this concrete box, there was no other furniture. There was a light, of course, up in the ceiling with the switch outside that I had no control over. And I found myself in this concrete box, 2 meters by 2 meters square, with 16 other guys. 16. The place was so crowded that you couldn't lie down without being on top of at least 3 or 4 other guys. We couldn't all sit together at the same time. And I realised then that things were pretty serious. Now, normally, I've been detained before. It's a part of what happens as a journalist. It's a bit of an occupational hazard, particularly when part of the job description is to get up the nose of the government. Normally, when that happens, there's a few phone calls, some embarrassed communications, maybe a rap on the knuckles, and you're released and allowed to go, or at the very worst, kicked out of the country. The next morning, I was taken to the National Intelligence Directorate, which is the secret police, the Interior Ministry's security agency. And that's where I learned the charges that we were facing. We'd been accused of aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, being members of a terrorist organisation, financing terrorism, and broadcasting false news with intent to undermine national security. Now, when you think about it, those charges are about as serious as you could possibly get, short of actually pulling the pin on a grenade and rolling it into the middle of a crowded room. We were facing life in prison. That became a very scary moment. Now, soon after, I was placed in solitary confinement. And that's when I realised something very profound. And this is, I think, the first takeaway. I realised that in this concrete box that I was in, I actually had the things that I needed for survival. We had water. It was potable water. It wasn't great, but it was there. We had food. Again, it wasn't wonderful food. It wasn't restaurant quality food, but it'd keep you alive. And we had shelter. Food, water, shelter. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic things that you need for survival. And in that space, I realised that the only thing that was going to get me, the greatest danger of all, was inside my own head. Prison is a psychological problem when you think about it. Detention physically doesn't do anything to you beyond limit where you can move, what you can do, who you can see. But its intent is to put pressure on you psychologically, and particularly solitary confinement. Now, at one level, this sounds like an easy lesson to learn. It's in your head, so all you need to do is just sort of feel happy and everything will be fine. But I realised that it's incredibly difficult. I'd seen some people in prison going crazy. That was the way I saw some of those guys in that concrete box with 16 of them, where 16 of them were there. They were quite literally going nuts. But I realised then that the only place to fight this is inside my own head. There's a fantastic philosopher, a guy called Viktor Frankl, who, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later, but he wrote a wonderful book called Man's Search for Meaning. And in that he said, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The freedom to choose one's own way. This is absolutely crucial to the way that we address a lot of the problems and challenges that we're faced, particularly when we're in a situation where we feel we don't have a choice, when in fact we do, and that choice exists inside our own head. How do we respond to any given situation? Well, we're stuck in a box facing terrorism charges. How do we respond to that? The difficulty then was to make sense of what was happening. See, there were three possible ways of understanding it. First of all, perhaps this was about misunderstanding the evidence. Perhaps they'd misinterpreted something that I'd said. Perhaps I'd got some factoid wrong. Perhaps we'd been misquoted in some way. I was pretty sure that the journalism was solid, but I thought maybe they've kind of looked at what we'd done and somehow messed that up. But when we think about the gap between what we were accused of doing, those very serious terrorism charges, and what we were actually doing, which was, I think, vanilla journalism, it was so wide that I couldn't see how anybody could have come to that conclusion. And we thought, well, maybe it's about a narrative about Al Jazeera's supposed involvement in the politics of Egypt at the time. You see, Al Jazeera is owned by the Qatari government, and Qatar had been accused of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, in the Egyptians' mind, perhaps we were agents of the Qataris or agents of Al Jazeera, somehow secretly working to undermine the Egyptian state. But if that was the case, why would you come after an Australian who'd only been in the country for a couple of weeks, who spoke no Arabic, and who really didn't have any connections with the place? I didn't fit that narrative. It didn't make any sense. So the third option, the third possibility, was that this could be about an attack on press freedom, and they were coming after us because we were politically convenient. Now, this is a big deal, choosing which of these narratives we understood, because it would affect the strategy that we would use to fight the charges. If it was about the evidence, then all we needed to do was to kind of explain the evidence and show that we were no threat, and it'll go away. If it was about the politics of the region, then we needed to separate ourselves from Al Jazeera, align ourselves with the Egyptians, and then we'd be fine. And if it was about press freedom, we needed to stand on the principle. This is, as I said, a really big deal. If we got it wrong, we were going to spend a hell of a long time in prison. We had some huge arguments. I tell you, it was just extraordinary. We almost came to blows on a couple of occasions trying to work out what to do. And in the end, I realised something quite profound. Takeaway number 2. That if we didn't know what the right strategy was, because the Egyptian political system and the judicial system was so incredibly opaque that we had no way of knowing what was really going on behind this, and so we really didn't know which strategy would work. So if we didn't know what the right strategy was, what if we flipped the question? How do we feel if a given strategy fails? How would we feel about ourselves? And at that point, the answer became absolutely clear. If it was about the evidence, if we sort of tried to dismiss the evidence, then I would have felt that it was the kind of cheap way out. If we'd aligned ourselves with the Egyptian authorities, if we'd distanced ourselves from Al Jazeera, and that had failed, I'd have felt quite sick. But if we'd stood up on principle and said, no, this is about an attack on press freedom. It's got nothing to do with the work that we'd done, but about everything we'd come to represent, and that strategy had failed, then I'd be able to stand on my own 2 feet, be able to stand proud and say we had still done the right thing. And so that's what we did. I wrote 2 letters declaring this to be an attack on press freedom. We smuggled them out of prison. And those letters were published, and they changed the whole nature of the battle. They gave license to my colleagues and my parents to join us in the fight, to help us, to support us, to say that this was an attack on press freedom. Now, I don't know, frankly, whether any of those other strategies would have worked. I don't know whether I would have spent less time in prison, whether I'd have been released sooner. But I do know that I am proud of the choice that we ultimately made and the stance that we took. I didn't think it. About 6 months later, when our trial finally ended, though, and we were finally convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. That was a bad day. That was a very, very tough day for us. I still remember feeling as though I'd been punched in the guts when that happened. And when I went back to the cell, I remember feeling incredibly angry, really bitterly angry. I was furious at the people who'd put us in prison. I was furious at the prison itself. I was furious that I couldn't live the life that I had before. I was bitterly angry that I wasn't able to spend time with my friends, to do the cooking that I love, to go and explore Africa in the way that I've been doing for most of my professional life. Until one moment, I had another epiphany. I realized that actually what had happened was that I created this fantasy world inside my own head. I created this idea of where I wanted to be, of what I thought should have happened. And then I was angry that that reality hadn't taken place. And that's crazy when you think about it. The fact is that I was stuck in this concrete box, and all the amount of anger in the world wasn't going to change that. And the people that I was angry with, they didn't know. They didn't care. It affected them not one tiny jot. And inside that concrete box, the only person that was being harmed by the anger was me. Now, I'm telling you this not because it was easy to then simply throw the anger out the window and laugh it off and suddenly be happy. But what it did was it allowed me to recognize the anger as a legitimate response to what was going on, to see it from the outside, to see it as something that was actually not only crazy but damaging myself, and to let it go. Now, at this point, what I want to do is talk a little bit about hope. A lot of times people ask me and people say to me, you must have had hope when you're in prison. You must have hoped for your freedom. And for a while that I did, we always hoped that this would go away. We hoped that we'd be released. We hoped that the court would see the stupidity of the charges against us and acquit us. We hoped that the president would pardon us. And at each stage of this process, the hope was dashed. And I came to realize something, again, that stuck with me ever since. And that's that hope is toxic. Hope is not a strategy. That's crossing your fingers, and crossing your fingers isn't a solution to a problem. You don't get out of a problem by hoping. There's a wonderful Buddhist nun called Pema Chodron who says that we should all have a fridge magnet that says, abandon hope. And it's not, her message is not that you should give up. It's not that you should lay down and die. what she's saying is that you need to recognise that hope is not a strategy, that hoping takes you away from where you are, and that the only thing you can ever address is what's actually in front of you, what's around you. And I also realised something else, that, and this is what I understand about this, and when I talk to people, I realise that these things can seem very obvious. The way I'm describing it can seem quite clear, and it's very, very difficult to translate what I'm talking about into normal life, into real life. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they have what they call the Serenity Prayer. And the Serenity Prayer says, Lord, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And it's always occurred to me that in the Serenity Prayer, the toughest thing is that last bit, the wisdom to know the difference. Now in Egypt, it was very easy for me to see the things that I couldn't change. I couldn't change the reality of the concrete box that I was stuck in. I had no power over it. I had no way of opening up that door and walking out. I couldn't speak to the people that had locked me up. I couldn't change that. And then, as I said earlier, when I was quoting Frankl, that the only thing I could change was my own attitude. That's not easy in normal life. If you don't like school, you've got three choices. You either, as the Serenity Prayer says, you either change the situation that you're in, and if you can't change it, you have the serenity to accept it. And if you can do neither of those two things, the only thing left is for you to change your own attitude. But understanding that difference is not easy. Understanding the difference between what you can change and what you can't is tough. If you're in a relationship that's making you unhappy, do you leave the relationship? Do you change the relationship? What do you do? These are not easy questions, and I can't give you easy answers. And so I want to understand and acknowledge and recognise that it's a tough thing to do, to know the difference between what you can change and what you can't change and what you need to change within yourself. But it is, I think, a really, really important lesson. There's one other thing that I think is really important here. Viktor Frankl wrote his book Man's Search for Meaning after the Second World War. Frankl was a survivor of the Nazi death camps. He was a Jewish neurologist. He went through Auschwitz and a number of the other camps, and he survived. And he wrote Man's Search for Meaning because he was trying to understand the difference between those people who had survived and those who had not. And Frankl realised that apart from the randomness, the difference between those who had made it through and those who died along the way wasn't their physical strength. It wasn't even their kind of perceived force of will or self-discipline. For a lot of them, it was the reason that they were suffering. Frankl quoted a German philosopher called Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche said, "He who has a why can bear any how." As long as you have a reason for the suffering or the struggle that you're going through, you can put up with pretty much anything. But that reason, and here's the key, the reason has to be bigger than yourself. It's got to be about an idea or a principle or an ideology. If it's just about you, that's when we tend to give up. But if it's about something bigger than you, it's about your family or your friends or your loved ones or an idea or a concept or a principle, then you can put up with pretty much anything. And for us, I realised, after we'd made the decision, I realised that it was about press freedom, that we were fighting for a principle, and that gave it meaning and purpose. It wasn't personal. And that made me far stronger than I thought possible. There's one more thing I want to leave you with. I'm going to do a little bit of mind reading. I'm going to guess that at some point in my presentation, each and every person who's listening to this has thought the same thing. I'll bet that each of you has thought, if I was in that guy's position, how would I have coped? And I'm telling you, if I'd been sitting where you are now, I'd have said, there's no way. I couldn't put up with 4 days, much less 400. It'd drive me nuts. But here's the thing. I'm just an ordinary bloke from Brisbane. I went to Indooroopilly State High School. I'm no different to anybody else. I'm just lucky enough to have learned that I'm far stronger than I ever give myself credit for. I think each and every person is far stronger than they give themselves credit for. I'm not saying everyone would have coped with it the same way, but I'm pretty sure that every one of you would have coped in ways that you can't possibly imagine. As I said, I'm just lucky enough to have had the chance to figure that out. Thanks very much.